live in interesting times on tonight's headlines. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced the indefinite suspension of a proposed extradition bill, which sparked days of mass protests. Philippines urges U.S. to help uphold state sovereign rights in the South China Sea. And calling Iran a nation of terror, President Trump publicly accused the Persian Gulf of responsibility for recent attacks on oil tankers near the strategic Strait of Hormuz. Dozens of homes have been flooded in Lincolnshire after a river burst its banks following heavy rain that pummeled the United Kingdom this week. Good evening, everyone. I'm Alma Angeles, and welcome to the program and now to the news. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced the indefinite suspension of a proposed extradition bill, which sparked days of mass protests. Lam said she made the decision in response to widespread public unhappiness over the measure, which would enable authorities to send some suspects to stand trial in mainland courts. Let's listen in.
After repeated internal deliberations over the last 2 days, I now announce that the government has decided to suspend the legislative amendment exercise, restart our communication with all sectors of society, do more explanation work, and listen to different views of society. I want to stress that the government is adopting an open mind to heed comprehensively different views in society towards the bill. The Secretary for Security will send a letter to the Legislative Council President to withdraw the notice of resumption of the second reading debate on the bill. In other words, the Council will halt its work in relation to the bill until our work in communication, explanation, and listening to opinions is completed. We have no intention to set a deadline for this work and promise to report to and consult members of the Legislative Council panel on security before we decide on the next step forward.
A mass protest over the issue was planned for Sunday. Hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong residents took to the streets in earlier demonstrations. Protests turned violent on Wednesday, adding to pressures on Lam to back down. Meanwhile, the last British governor of Hong Kong has said the United Kingdom should have a sense of honor about its former colony and a specific sense of, quote, our obligations to the individual citizens. Chris Patton said that meant speaking up about massive protests against a proposed extradition policy, which would allow Hong Kong suspects to be tried in mainland China. Let's listen in.
I think that it's true that this issue of extradition doesn't deal with one particular line or clause in the joint declaration in the treaty. It goes much further than that, I think. It hits a stake into the middle of the heart of the whole notion of one country, two systems, because that did depend to some extent, and I think the Chinese when Deng Xiaoping was around, understood this. It does depend on having a difference between the rule of law in Hong Kong and what passes for the law in China. And once you have this extradition proposal in place, and I hope it'll be dropped even at this late hour, once that's in place, then you demolish the firewall between Hong Kong's way of life and what's happening in mainland China. And that's what really worries people, and that's what really, I think, concerns not just lawyers, not just those million people who were on the streets last weekend, but the business community as well. We should have a sense of honor about Hong Kong, and we should have a specific sense of our obligations to the individual citizens of Hong Kong. And that means speaking up about what's been happening. It means working with our allies and friends in Europe, in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, to make it clear to China and to the government in Hong Kong, which is by and large manipulated or told what to do by Beijing and the United Front activists in Hong Kong. We should make it clear that this is not a policy or a succession of policies which we're prepared to stand by and ignore.
Meanwhile, for the freedom of navigation to mean anything in the South China Sea, the United States must also use its power to uphold the sovereign rights of states surrounding the strategic waters. That is according to Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin Jr. A statement from the U.S. Embassy said, "We saw news reports of the collision at sea, and we are thankful none of the Filipino fishermen lost their lives and glad that Vietnamese fishermen rescued them from the open sea. Our position on the South China Sea is clear. We support lawful uses of the sea, respect for international law, unimpeded lawful commerce, and peace and stability, and we urge all parties to refrain from using coercion and intimidation to assert their territorial and maritime claims." Meanwhile, DFA chief said, or the foreign secretary said, that the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea by itself is merely the freedom to walk in a zoo past cages of animals. Freedom of navigation to mean anything includes willingness to use U.S. power to uphold the sovereign rights of the littoral states of Southeast Asia, or it is nothing. The last time the U.S. opened its mouth, it told the Philippines and China to stand down in Scarborough and withdraw. We did. China stayed. The U.S. was silent. Silence gives consent, and we lost. Under President Trump, this is supposed to change. Former President Obama's craven diplomats must be purged from state, he said. Eagle News International will be right back. Stay tuned.
Visiting the Philippines, Manila or Quezon City is a popular destination. But oftentimes the hustle and bustle of the city can be more stressful on your vacation. So when you feel the need to reconnect to nature or relax again, there's a beautiful oasis just outside of the city called the Garden at Ciudad de Victoria. That you can see here include hydrangea, snapdragon, and stargazers. They're truly beautiful. The gardens at Ciudad de Victoria are so peaceful, tranquil, and beautiful that it's become a haven for young couples and a very popular venue for engagement photos. The next time you want an escape from the big city, the garden at Ciudad de Victoria is a wonderful place to visit.
Health is
And we're still following developments out of Hong Kong. The chief or the leader said on Taiwan's insistence that it would not allow a man suspected of killing a Hong Kong woman to be extradited, helped in her decision to withdraw the proposed amendment to the fugitive offenders of the law. Carrie Lam said the case was one reason driving a rush to get it passed, but that the original urgency is perhaps no longer there. Lam had argued the need to push for the unpopular legislation, the extradition bill, out of sympathy for the family of the woman who was killed. Take a look.
In fact, in consideration of the overt and clear expression by Taiwan repeatedly that it would not accede to the suggested arrangement of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government in the transfer of the concerned suspect, the original urgency to pass the bill in this legislative year is perhaps no longer there. But give us another chance. We will not only do this bill well, if in our engagement of people, we can get more diverse opinions, we can build broader consensus to do it, we'll do it. But we have other things to do. We have the economy to look after, we have livelihood issues to address. In any confrontations that I have seen on Wednesday, it is very possible that when it recurs again, there will be even more serious confrontations. The 80 or so injuries, very minor, generally minor injuries that we have seen, may be replaced by very serious injuries to my police colleagues and to ordinary citizens, whether they are very fierce protesters or just ordinary students joining the protest. I don't want any of that injuries to happen. Under the basic law, the chief executive has due accountability. She or he is responsible to the Central People's Government, but at the same time, responsible to the people of Hong Kong. And what is more important, that is in the basic law, every act of every person, including the government, the chief executive, has to be lawful. So even if your boss, even in any sort of situation, in a private enterprise, if your boss who pays your salary asks you to do something unlawful, you shouldn't do that. You wouldn't do it, right? So I hope that explains the relationship between the chief executive and the Central People's Government. But what you have been told by the Commissioner of Police is some, I wouldn't say all, definitely not all, because we're talking about 40,000 people maybe, some of the protesters were quite violent. And if you look at some of the weapons that the police had seized, they were not sort of equipment that one would deploy in a peaceful protest or a peaceful assembly on a social issue. And have you looked at the bricks? Large numbers of bricks throwing at the police.
With tensions between Washington and Tehran escalating following attacks on two tankers near the Strait of Hormuz, Benham Talibu sees Iran shifting its strategy from trying to wait out the Trump administration to escalating tensions to escape the administration's powerful sanctions. Take a look.
For the first year of the max pressure campaign, Iran had tried to wait out the Trump administration. But once it realized that the administration is making Iran's strategy of patience costly, Iran is now trying to lash out and get the Trump administration to swerve. So what we're watching here in some ways is a big game of chicken.
Talibu is a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which was critical of President Barack Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. It backs President Trump's maximum pressure campaign of sanctions to get Iran back to the negotiating table. Trump blamed Iran for the attacks and called it a nation of terror. And Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe condemned the suspected attack on the Japanese-operated tanker as a threat to safe maritime navigation. Now, Talibu says the attacks on that tanker, as well as the Norwegian one, fit in with Tehran's past attacks on commercial shipping in the region's waters.
When you look at Iran's history of mining, particularly in the Persian Gulf, it is not limited to the Trump administration. This is something that goes back to the Iran-Iraq War as a military tactic.
The British government says it agrees with a U.S. conclusion that Iran attacked the tankers, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is calling for an independent investigation. Talibu says a big question now is whether U.S. allies begin to move closer to the U.S. position on Iran.
I think where the Trump administration has had most success is the economic side of the max pressure campaign. But for this to translate into a political success, we're going to have to see the allies begin to echo the same concerns about Iranian behavior that Washington has. I don't think either side is looking for a conflict. In fact, there has been talk about what happens if not America pushes back on Iran, but what if a U.S. partner or ally pushes back on Iran? Would Iran respond against American assets in a major way, thus necessitating a kinetic response against the Iranian homeland? It's important to have prudent military planning, but it's important to have the military planners in the Pentagon have this planning. Talking about it, I think, publicly doesn't help.
Meanwhile, excerpts have been released of the emergency audio broadcast by the vessel that came to the rescue of one of the tankers that was apparently attacked near the Strait of Hormuz on Thursday. Take a look.
All station. Motor vessel Hyundai Dubai, master is speaking. Motor tanker front Altair in fire, in position 25 degrees, 25.5 north. Longitude 057 degrees, 22.8 east. Motor tanker front Altair in fire. As reported by master of front Altair, most probably torpedo attack. Vessel still loaded, tanker risk of explosion. For all vessel in vicinity, keep clear CPA from motor tanker front Altair. I repeat position, latitude 25 degrees, 25.5 north. Longitude 057 degrees, 22.8 east. Motor tanker, front Altair.
Maritime publication Trade Winds published the audio recording of the captain of the Hyundai Dubai speaking about the fire on board the Norwegian-owned MT Front Altair. The Front Altair, loaded with naphtha from the United Arab Emirates, radioed for help as its cargo caught fire after a suspected attack about 40 kilometers off the southern coast of Iran. The captain of the Hyundai Dubai is heard saying his counterpart on the Norwegian owner container tanker believed the tanker had been hit by a torpedo. The U.S. military says it believes the vessel and another tanker were targeted by limpet mines and has blamed Iran for the attack. Tehran denies being involved. Meanwhile, calling Iran a nation of terror, President Trump publicly accused the Persian Gulf nation of responsibility for recent attacks on oil tankers near the strategic Strait of Hormuz. President Trump said Iran's culpability was exposed by the United States. While calling into Fox News Channel's Fox Friends, he said of the Thursday attacks, Iran did do it. Take a look.
We're being very tough on sanctions. When I came into office, they were an absolute terror. They're a nation of terror. And they've changed a lot since I've been president, I can tell you. They were unstoppable, and now they're in deep, deep trouble.
While Iran has denied being involved in the attacks, U.S. Central Command released this footage. It said shows Iran's Revolutionary Guard removing an unexploded limpet mine from the Japanese-owned tanker Kokuka Courageous. The tanker attacks coincided with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to Iran. Abe, a Trump ally, had taken a similar message encouraging a return to negotiations on his visit to Tehran. U.S. officials said on Thursday that the Trump administration was considering a return to providing naval escorts to vessels transiting through the maritime choke point. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, a prominent ally of the Republican president, called on the U.S. to begin the escorts immediately in an interview with Fox Friends earlier on Friday.
They're not going to be closing it. It's not going to be, if it's closed, it's not going to be closed for long. And they know it. And they've been told in very strong terms. And we want to get them back to the table if they want to go back. I'm ready when they are.
Meanwhile, acting U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Jonathan Cohen, after the closed-door consultations of the Security Council, the United States assesses that Iran is responsible for the attacks on the two tankers in the Gulf of Oman.
The United States assesses that Iran is responsible for these attacks. No proxy group in the area has the resources or skill to act with this level of sophistication. Iran, however, has the weapons, the expertise, and the requisite intelligence information to pull this off. And Iran is doing just what it promised. Tehran declared on April 22nd that it would interrupt the flow of oil through the Straits of Hormuz. The United States will continue its diplomatic and economic efforts to bring Iran to the negotiating table, and Iran should meet us with diplomacy, not with terror, attacks on ships, infrastructure, and diplomatic facilities.
Just last month, the U.S. ended waivers that allowed some countries to continue buying Iranian oil, a move that's starving Iran of oil income, and that coincided with what U.S. officials called a surge in intelligence pointing to Iranian preparations for attacks against U.S. forces and interests in the Gulf region. In response to those intelligence warnings, the U.S. on May 5 announced it was accelerating the deployment of the USS Abraham Lincoln Aircraft Carrier Battle Group to the Gulf region. It also sent 4 nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to Qatar and has beefed up its defenses in the region by deploying more Patriot air defense systems. Officials said that Pentagon deliberations about possibly sending more military resources to the region, including more Patriot missile batteries, could be accelerated by Thursday's dramatic attack on the oil tankers. At the Pentagon, Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan said Iran is not just a U.S. problem.
As you know, we're always planning various contingencies. I emphasized earlier this need to develop international consensus. When you look at the situation, a Norwegian ship, Japanese ship, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, 15% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So we obviously need to make contingency plans should the situation deteriorate, but we also need to broaden our support for this international situation.
The head of the Arab League is calling on the Iranians to be careful and reverse course. Secretary General Ahmed Aboud Abul Gate noted after meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the UN headquarters in New York that there are conflicting reports about how Thursday's tanker incidents occurred. He said, "We believe that responsibilities need to be clearly defined. The facts will be revealed. I am sure it's only a matter of time." The U.S. said the Iranians are responsible for the attacks near the strategic Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians say they were not involved. Abul Gate said, quote, "My call to my Iranian, and I call them Iranian brothers, be careful and reverse course because you're pushing everybody towards a confrontation that no one would be safe if it happens." In other news, heavy rains in southern China caused landslides and floods, killing at least 61 people, according to broadcaster CCTV. Take a look. Now, according to CCTV, rescuers are still searching for 14 missing people. So far this week, 356,000 people have been evacuated from their homes in 8 provinces in southern and central China. Economic losses are now estimated at 13.35 billion yuan or $1.93 billion US dollars. More rainstorms are expected to hit provinces in the south and east of the country in the coming days. Meanwhile, a bridge collapsed in South China's Guangdong province early on Friday, but the total number of casualties remains unclear, according to state media CCTV. Surveillance footage showed 2 cars falling into the river as the bridge collapsed. One man was rescued by a security guard nearby, while authorities are still searching for other potential survivors. The cause of the bridge collapse is under investigation, and it's unknown whether the incident was related to recent flooding in Guangdong province. In other news, dozens of homes have been flooded in Lincolnshire after a river burst its banks following heavy rain that pummeled the United Kingdom this week.
The water was, the big problem, how fast it was coming into the village as well. So as fast as we were able to put it somewhere else, it was just continuing in back for us. So it was a real struggle.
Military helicopters were brought in to Wainfleet to assist emergency services, carrying with them 170 tons of gravel to be dropped to stop the water flow. An estimated 44 people were evacuated from Wainfleet, among 100 across the county. Up to 720 people could be affected by the heavy rain, according to the Lincolnshire County Council, after the town was hit with more than 2 months' worth of rain in 2 days. A total of 13 flood warnings and 46 flood alerts were in place Friday. Clashes erupted between the police and protesters in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo at the end of demonstrations against pension reforms and cuts in the education budget proposed by the government.
Caso o governo não escute a voz das ruas, o futuro é sombrio. A retirada de direitos, a gente pensa num país que está descendo a cada dia na escala social, na escala de direitos, está descendo na sua educação e a gente não vê aonde isso pode parar.
The action was part of a general strike organized by trade unions. Authorities in Rio Grande do Sul said 76 people who participated in the protests had been detained, including 54 in the state capital of Porto Alegre. Police shot tear gas and rubber bullets at some protesters who had shot fireworks and other objects at them. With thousands of people on the streets of Brazil, the strikes paralyzed schools, universities, banks, and affected public transport in some cities across the country. The protests, however, were not as big as the demonstration that took place in May against cuts in the education budget, which brought hundreds of thousands to the streets. Now, this was the first strike faced by the far-right President Jair Bolsonaro, who took office in January 1st. His administration is trying to convince the Congress to approve a pension reform that will raise the retirement age to 65 for men and 62 for women and increase workers' contributions. The government says the reform could save about 1 trillion reals or $260 billion and help save the troubled social security system from bankruptcy. Workers Central Unique, one of the trade unions that called the strike, said that 45 million people took part. Bolsonaro's government ignored Friday's general strike, and the press office of the president said it wouldn't release any statements. And we'll be back with the business news right after this break. Stay tuned.
Tungkulin ng MTRCV ang mag-provide
Net25 shows live and on demand anytime, anywhere, on any mobile device on OSN Play.
For Business News, this is Cesar Vallejos. The Department of Trade and Industry is asking for a 50% increase in its budget to expand programs for small businesses and heighten consumer protection initiatives. Trade Secretary Ramon Lopez said he personally attended budget meetings to appeal for a 50% fund hike for the DTI. If approved, it will be utilized to bankroll the trade body's programs for micro, small, and medium enterprises. A 50% increase would put the DTI's budget next year at about 7.24 billion pesos from the 4.83 billion this year. According to Lopez, the DTI is targeting to fill in the balance of over 1,400 municipalities that are still without negosyo centers. The trade body also has to employ workers for vacant plantilla positions in the existing 1,070 negosyo centers. Over one-third of the DTI's 4.83 billion peso budget, or 1.83 billion, is allocated for MSME development programs. Foreign banks' interest in setting up operations in the local banking industry remains high, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas governor said 5 years after the sector's full liberalization for international entrants. BSP Chief Benjamin Diokno confirmed that several foreign banks are still eyeing the Philippine banking system as their next destination to put up their branches due to the country's level of attractiveness in the investing community. Right now, there are 12 banks that came in after the liberalization. There is a lot of interest, and I'm not surprised why, because the Philippines is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. So there's really interest here, Diokno said at the recent Business Mirror Coffee Club Forum in Makati City. And also we have embarked on our Build, Build, Build program, so those who are interested in participating in the country's construction boom, they also need their banks here, he added. While he could not divulge which banks have shown interest, he said most of those planning to enter the Philippine financial system include those from Taiwan and South Korea and one from Europe. The governor said that some local banks are also planning to expand abroad to cater to Filipinos living outside the country. The young population in Association of Southeast Asian Nations member countries remains its biggest asset in terms of attracting financing needed to plug the region's infrastructure constraints like those from the United States. In an infrastructure forum for ASEAN journalists at the Asian Development Bank headquarters on Thursday, U.S. Embassy Counselor for Economic Affairs Lynn Gadowski said the youth bulge in the region ensures the economic growth and presence of various opportunities in the ASEAN. Gadowski said the Philippines, for one, is said to already be in the demographic sweet spot where the mean age is 24 to 25 years old. The rest of ASEAN are on the same boat, with the below 20 population accounting for 34.5% in 2017, according to the Jakarta-based ASEAN Secretariat. In terms of infrastructure and U.S. support for ASEAN, this region is incredibly important to the United States. It has been for decades and will continue to be for centuries. Administrations come and go, but the prioritization of this region is incredibly important to the United States, Gadowski said. Economic growth opportunity, I think we're increasingly struck by the demographics as you look at the youth bulge, she added. Oil prices rose again Friday in reaction to geopolitical tension building on the previous day's surge sparked by blasts on two tankers in the Gulf of Oman. The U.S. government blamed Iran for mysterious explosions on the tankers, and there were growing fears that Tehran could close the Strait of Hormuz, a major choke point for world oil shipments. Despite a potentially disastrous standoff between the two foes, oil traders were not getting carried away, said Craig Erlam, senior market analyst at Wanda. Prices jumped by more than 4% at one stage on Thursday as reports of the attacks in the Gulf of Oman flashed onto traders' screens and added around 1% Friday. India has decided to raise tariffs on imports of 29 goods from the U.S. after having deferred the move several times since announcing it last year, media reported Saturday. The government had said last June it would raise import taxes on a slew of U.S. goods, including almonds and apples, apparently irked by Washington's refusal to exempt New Delhi from higher steel and aluminum tariffs. But it delayed raising tariffs several times as trade talks between the world's two biggest democracies raised hopes of a resolution. However, President Donald Trump's decision to strip New Delhi of its preferential trade status earlier this month appears to have triggered the latest Indian move. There would be no further delays in imposing the retaliatory tariffs, the Economic Times reported, quoting a government official, with the new taxes due to take effect from Sunday. The Press Trust of Indian news agency said the finance minister would make a formal announcement soon, although it had already conveyed its decision to the United States. The United Auto Workers Union has suffered a fresh defeat at a Volkswagen plant in Tennessee, with workers narrowly voting down a move to organize the factory for a second time. The UAW has never managed to fully organize a U.S. plant owned by a foreign manufacturer, and a win at the German carmaker's Chattanooga facility would have been a significant victory. But the 1,700-strong workforce at the factory rejected the move by a margin of 833-776 in a ballot that concluded Friday. The organizing effort was attacked by state Republicans and hampered by an ongoing federal corruption probe, with a former vice president of the auto union soon to be sentenced after pleading guilty to misappropriating funds. Pending certification of the results by the National Labor Relations Board and a legal review of the election, Volkswagen will respect the decision of the majority, said the carmaker's Chattanooga plant chief Frank Fisher. We look forward to continuing our close cooperation with elected officials and business leaders in Tennessee. Our EBC Russian Bureau was able to talk to House Speaker Gloria Arroyo when she attended the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Arroyo is pushing for the protection and legalization of OFWs in Russia. Our EBC correspondent in Russia, Marisol Bumanlag, reports from Moscow.
Speaker Gloria Macapagal Arroyo arrived Russia to discuss labor agreement of Filipino workers in Russia together with Russian officials. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo calls to legalize workers to lessen the percentage of severe illegal recruitment and human trafficking cases. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo visited Russia for the purpose of legalization of overseas Filipino workers in Russia and to discuss about the bilateral agreement between Philippines and the said country. Aiming to add in her voice and to emphasize the legalization of Filipino workers, Arroyo also aims to aid the problems of Filipinos that fall as a victim of illegal recruiters and human traffickers.
I decided to go to St. Petersburg again this time because one of the topics was about immigration policy. And I have been aware that our Filipinos here have a problem with the immigration authorities. So I decided to take the opportunity to add my voice to the many advocates who are saying that we should have a bilateral labor agreement with Russia.
How is it possible?
Well, when we had our discussion, there were those who were very open to it already, like the head of the visa department. There were those who were still a little bit hesitant, like the deputy minister of development, and there were those who preferred to concentrate on liberalization on the professionals and licensed workers, like the big corporations.
Addition to that, Arroyo also mentioned that some of the Russian officials she talked with agreed to legalize Filipino workers in Russia, and others are still hesitant.
But there were also those, aside from the head of the visa, which is very important, there are also those like the government of Leningrad region, who say that the work of Filipinos taking care of houses and children is just as important as the work of the skilled professionals, licensed professionals. So that was very heartwarming, and the university professor agreed with him as well. So this is I hope that it will contribute to our advocacy, especially because the head of the visa section is saying that he's open to negotiating the bilateral labor agreement.
How do you feel for yung pagsalubong ko sa inyo ng ating mga
Oh, I'm so happy. I'm so happy that in many of their comments are very appreciative of the work I've done for them, and I'm so happy that they were able to ask questions that are very relevant to their life here and the lives of their families back home. And I hope that we gave them answers that were at least a little bit satisfactory.
The said visit is considered a successful one according to Ambassador Carlos Soreta, and the head of visa department here in Russia is open for legalization of domestic helpers, skilled workers, and professional Filipinos to work in this country legally without any predicament.
Daan-daan Filipino nag-hello sa kanya at nag-picture. Dito naman sa embassy, we had about 100 people attend at mga maganda yung mga tanong, maganda yung sagot niya. She's very happy na ma-meet ang Filipino community dito sa mosque. Ito yung pinakaunang Filipino community na pinuntahan niya. Pakita niya na ang mga Filipino workers natin na-contribute sa lipunan ng kung nasaan sila. Nakakatulong sila sa mga pamilya na gusto magtrabaho, lalo na yung parehong asawa, makakatrabaho, makakakontribute sa Russian economy. So nag-agree naman yung ibang panelists, mga matataas na opisyal at saka mga taga-private sector. I think in terms of bringing more emphasis on the issue sa mga Russian officials at private sector, nagsaksido siya na ipakita sa i-convey sa kanila na napakaseryoso ang Pilipinas na magkaroon ng maligalize ang mga Pilipinos dito at maligalize ang proseso ng pag-recruitment ng Filipino workers na papunta Russia.
Reporting from Moscow, Russia, this is Marisol Bumanlag, and I am 1 with 25.
That's it for Business News. This is Cesar Vallejos. I'm 1 with 25. Eagle News International will be back. Stay with us.
Linggo sa Season 3.
NBA, an upstart Toronto Raptors squad dethroned defending champions Golden State on Thursday, defeating the Warriors 114-110 to win the NBA Finals and capture the first crown by a club from outside the United States. Kyle Lowry and Pascal Siakam each scored 26 points, while Kawhi Leonard and reserve Fred VanVleet both had 22 as Toronto won the best-of-7 series 4-2. Leonard was named the NBA Finals Most Valuable Player for the second time in his career after the first in 2014 with San Antonio, which traded him to the Toronto last July. The Raptors became the first Canadian club to win a major North American sports title since the 1993 Toronto Blue Jays captured Major League Baseball's World Series. The Raptors spoiled the Warriors' farewell appearance at the Oracle Arena. Golden State's home since 1971 will be replaced by a new $1 billion venue in San Francisco next season. Klay Thompson scored 30 points to lead the Warriors but left the game with a left knee injury late in the third quarter after landing awkwardly on his left leg. It was the latest setback for an injury-hit Golden State team that was already without two-time NBA Finals Most Valuable Player Kevin Durant, who returned in Game 5 Monday after being sidelined for a month only to suffer a ruptured right Achilles tendon. Andre Iguodala added 22 points for the Warriors, Stephen Curry had 21, and Draymond Green contributed 11 points, 18 rebounds, and 13 assists. Golden State had a final shot to win, trailing 111-110, but Curry missed a three-pointer and Green called a timeout when the team had none, setting up 3 final free throws by Leonard to seal the victory. The Warriors failed in their bid for a third consecutive title and to become the first team in 50 years to win 4 titles in 5 seasons. Toronto's triumph made this the first NBA Finals where road teams won 5 consecutive games. Lowry scored 21 points in the first half to give Toronto a 60-57 lead, hitting 7-10 shots from the floor and 4 of 5 from three-point range. Thompson led the Warriors with 18 first-half points. Iguodala scored 6 points in a 14-4 Warriors run, joining Curry and Thompson in hitting three-pointers in the spurt to give Golden State an 80-76 advantage just before disaster struck again. Thompson landed awkwardly on his left leg on a missed shot and went to the floor writhing in pain, being held to the locker room with a knee injury as the Warriors called a timeout. Walking to the locker room, Thompson turned back and returned to the court, a standing crowd screaming with delight to see him sink 2 free throws. Thompson couldn't have returned had he not shot the free throws, which gave the Warriors their biggest lead, 85-80. But after he was seen limping, Thompson was removed and later ruled out with left knee injury, seen walking out the arena on crutches. Meanwhile, VanVleet sank 2 three-pointers in his 3 free throws with 5:39 remaining, pulled the Raptors level at 99-99. VanVleet struck again from three-point range and Serge Ibaka scored off a rebound to put Toronto ahead 106-101 with 3 minutes and 3 seconds remaining. Green's three-pointer pulled the Warriors within 108-105, and after trading free throws, Cousins scored on a layup to pull Golden State within 109-108 with 46 seconds remaining. Siakam and Curry exchanged points, and a bad pass by Toronto's Danny Green set up Golden State's last possession. Thousands of fans stormed the streets of Toronto early Friday on a rowdy celebration of their hometown team's first ever NBA championship. The Toronto Raptors clinched the win over Golden State Warriors 114-110 shortly before midnight local time, taking the best-of-7 series 4-2 and becoming the first team outside the United States to win the world's premier basketball competition. Thousands of supporters dressed in teams red and black had gathered in pubs and bars across the city to watch the biggest game in Canadian basketball history. At the final buzzer, they poured out into downtown Toronto's Yonge Dundas Square, chanting the team's rallying cry, "We the North." Fireworks lit up the square as the crowd sang Queen's triumphal anthem, "We are the champions," while others kissed, danced, and shouted the team's name. In recent days, prominent landmarks had been decorated in the colors of the Raptors, including the Art Gallery of Ontario and the 3D illuminated Toronto sign in the city's Nathan Phillips Square. Cities across the country from Vancouver to Montreal joined in the revelry as Canada celebrated a rare sporting triumph over its southern neighbors. And these are the stories for EN Sports. I'm Ben Bernaldez and I'm 1 with 25.
Thank you, Ben. And finally in our news, the Gold Coast was illuminated with fireworks in celebration of Seafire 2019. Our EBC correspondent from Australia, Diego Madronio, is at the scene.
Here in Gold Coast, Australia, Multiculturalism is once again celebrated with another memorable night of breathtaking music and eye-opening fireworks that will light up the night skies all over the streets of Surfers Paradise.
Seafire is a light-up festival that celebrates with a night filled with entertainment. The event will go for 2 nights in a row, starting from the 31st of May and ending on the 1st of June, with the major event beginning from 4 p.m. and ending at 9 p.m. Seafire is a celebration of multiculturalism, where 4 nations, including Australia, are invited to hold an international fireworks competition. Those nations include USA, South Korea, and New Zealand. On the very first night of Seafire, all 4 nations are welcomed with their national anthem, after which they hold their friendly competition. The winner of the firework competition will then verse the current reigning champion on the next day, Team Philippines. The start of the second night is a tribute to Australia, opening with a welcome by Luther Kora, leader of the Ugambe language group. This is then followed with the national anthem of Australia and a cultural performance displaying Australia's heritage. The 2 teams will go head-to-head, leaving the crowd with a thrilling nail-biting competition. The winner will then be named the champions of the 2019 Seafire competition. As the night continues, many people enjoy the night with a wide variety of entertainment done by all 4 nations before and after the competition. Seafire allows people from all 4 nations to gather and celebrate this unique and special event. Australia is currently the only known country to hold an international firework competition, which is why it has been known to have such a high attendance. This is all in celebration of multiculturalism. Both nights are packed with entertainment that showcase the culture of each nation. Some of the performance groups that can be expected to be seen are Bollywood, Balinese, hula, Japanese drumming, Korean fashion, and many more. The event of Seafire is then concluded with a final firework expedition piece done by Australia's leading pyrotechnics team.
Reporting from Gold Coast, Australia, this is Diego Madronio, and I'm 1 with 25.
Thank you, Diego. And that's it for tonight's broadcast. For everyone here on Eagle News International, I'm Alma Angeles. Always 1 with 25. Good night.